Masiphathise mawethu emakhaya nakwindawo ngendawo enibukeleni kuzo. Enkosi ngokuba nathi kwinkqubo yethu yanamhlanje Yilungelo Lakho, it's your right. Igama lami ngalungusisanda Jonas, sizakuba nani ke ixesha elingangeyure. Siyanimema ukuba egameni kwexesha nani niphefumle kwincoko yethu yanamhlanje. Inombolo zethu apha ekhaya zithi ke 0117146918 okanye ku 0117146919. Email yethu consumer@sabc.co.za okanye ke nisifumane kwindlela zonxibelelwano zala maxesha iFacebook okanye kuTwitter. South African consumers can celebrate another gain, a law that will ensure the protection of their personal information from being illegally used by third parties. Any institution, entity or body found to have illegally used, collected or distributed anyone's personal information could face imprisonment of up to 10 years or a fine of up to 10 million rand. The Protection of Personal Information Bill has just been approved by Parliament after years in the making.
Esekusele nje ukuthi asayinde umongameli lomthetho omusha we the Protection of Personal Information Bill. Emva kalokho abathengi bazovikeleka ekutheni kusetshenziswe imininingwane yabo ngendlela engekho emthethweni. Seziyaphela izinsuku lapho izinkampani noma amabhizinisi anikela ngemininingwane yamakhasimende abo ngaphambi kokuthi bexhumane nawo. Sekuphele iminyaka abathengi bezama ukubalekela abathengisi abazama ukubathengisela izinto abangazidingi. Obekumangaza abathengi ukuthi labantu bazithathaphi izinombolo zabo. Manje ke abathengi sebezokhululeka njengoba sekusungulwe umthetho omusha wokukhoselwa kwemininingwane yabo. Kulaba abahehisa ngezinto abazithengisayo, njengoba ingalo yomthetho isizokwazi ukubavikela ukuthi izinkampani noma amabhange angandlulisi imininingwane yamakhasimende awo ngaphambi kokuthi bevumelane ukuthi bengenze njalo. Izitolo, amabhange kanye nezinkampani zamanye amabhizinisi kuzomela zenze isiqiniseko zokuthi bayivikela imininingwane yamakhasimende abo. Abangawulandeli ke lo mgomo bayohlangabezana nezimbila zithutha njengoba bangazithola sebevalelwe ejele cishe izinyanga eziyi12 kuyela enyakeni eyi10, kanti ke futhi bangathola sebehlawulise cishe u10 million wamarandi. Ihhovisi le the Information Regulator lizokwenza isiqiniseko sokuthi lo mthetho uyalandelwa. The Protection of Personal Information Bill izosiza ngokuqiniseka ukuthi imininingwane yabathengi ivikelekile futhi isetshenziswa ngendlela efanele. Lo mthetho uhambiselana nemithetho yakwamanye amazwe. Eminye yemigomo yalemthetho ukuthi izinkampani zizovumela ukuthi zithumele iSMS noma umyalezo owodwa kumthengi uma kukhona abafuna ukuthengisa. Uma ke umthengi engaphenduli, angeke zivumeleke ukuthi zithumele enye. Umphathiswa wezomthetho umnumzane uJeff Hadebe uthe lo mgomo uzovikela kakhulu imininingwane yabantu balapha eMzansi Afrika. Wagcizelela kakhulu futhi ekutheni ukukhosela kwemininingwane yabantu kubaleke kakhulu kubona ngoba kubanika inkululeko. Yingakho ke kumele kuhlonishwe. Kuyilungelo la wonke umuntu ukuthi ivikelwe imininingwane yakhe, futhi kusemthethweni ukuze wonke umuntu athole ukukhululeka. Ezeshoshovu zama-consumer rights zizithokozele kakhulu lezi zindaba zokuphasiswa kwalomthetho. Unompumelelo mthethwa Yilungelo Lakho eGoli.
Sibambe ngazibini ke kunompumelelo mthethwa ngelo nqaku. And now to take our discussion further on the Protection of Personal Information Bill and the protection it promises consumers, let's extend a warm welcome to our studio guest and masamkele ke Oriana Steyn. Yena, she's the Deputy Credit Ombudsman. And from our Durban studio, we are pleased to be joined by Llewellyn Landers. He is the chairperson of the National Assembly's Justice Portfolio Committee. We were expecting ke utata uThami Polani yena ke ongamele umbutho olwela amalungelo abathengi Consumer Fair. We're still hoping that he will join us. Rihanna, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Landers, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start off with you so that you can explain to us exactly what this law is about and its significance. Mr. Landers, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
All right then. I don't know if you got my question, but I needed you to explain what this law entails and also its significance.
The Protection of Personal Information will give expression to the right to privacy provided for in our Constitution. The right to privacy includes the right to protection against unlawful collection, retention, dissemination and use of one's personal information.
All right, but its significance though for South Africans, for consumers?
Well, its significance is that it provides persons with rights and remedies to protect their personal information from processing that is not in accordance with the bill.
Thank you very much for that. Rihanna, let me come to you in terms of your thoughts on this protection of personal information bill.
Well, you know, what we've seen over the past few years, and especially at the Credit Ombudsman, we're more involved with the Credit Act and, you know, all the regulations under that Act. But we've seen the Credit Act trying to protect consumers. We've seen the Consumer Protection Act trying to protect consumers. And now this is the third one. And it is really to try and protect consumers. And every time they try and protect consumers, Parliament, then obviously there was something wrong in the past. And I think that is what we've seen, especially with the National Credit Act. You know, there were so many abuses in the market. There were things that were dysfunctional. And they wrote the Act and they tried to fix that. The same with the Consumer Protection Act. There were so many things that we all know that was not going well, that people didn't have rights, they didn't know where to go, they didn't have recourse, and now the Act gives them that. And I think the same will happen here. There are people in this country who've been negatively affected by the selling of their personal information to third parties who then use that information. And now they've got rights, and they can exercise their rights with this bill. The consumers out there don't know it yet, but I mean, we'll have time, and in the media, everybody will make them aware, you now have a right, you've got a place to complain. And on the other side, the companies who process the information will suddenly have a whole list of requirements of things they can and can't do.
But let's look at your mandate from the Credit Ombudsman, from the Credit Ombuds Office, and how this PPIB will affect you.
Well, at the moment, of course, our mandate only extends to credit agreements, so consumers who complain about credit agreements, and especially the non-bank credit agreements, the furniture, the clothing, those accounts, the microloans, they can complain to us. We deal with the credit agreements. But then we also have a mandate at the moment to deal with credit information. So a portion of our work already deals with complaints about information, about the information not being correct, about not being kept too long. And we look at the Credit Act, of course, for guidance under that. So we look at what the credit bureaus do, we look at what the credit providers do, and the complaints are about information. At the moment, we don't have a mandate to look at complaints about anything under this Act. But we've got a little bit of experience about consumers complaining about my information is incorrect, it's used incorrectly, and I want to complain about that.
Mr. Landers, I want to come back to you and find out exactly the kind of problems that this bill is trying to or seeking to address.
Well, a business cannot collect, for example, more personal information than is necessary to fulfill the purpose of that particular business's activities. That's the first point. The second point, the bill seeks to provide for what is called an opt-in provision. Presently, the consumer and the individual is required by businesses and entities to opt out. The bill seeks to do away with that, so that the business and entity that is in possession of your information must obtain your written permission to further process your information. And so many of the wrongs referred to by Rihanna's stain, this bill seeks to correct. And in order to deal with many of the complaints she refers to, the bill also creates the Office of the Information Regulator. And that office is a commission type of office, and it will receive complaints, it will issue warnings and notices, and deal with many of the complaints referred to by the Credit Ombuds Office, and in that way seek to educate the general populace about the conditions of the Protection of Personal Information Act when it is signed into law by the President.
Okwangokuke makesitsi evenkleni, please join us after this. Welcome back. You're still on Yilungelo Lakho. It's your right. We are still discussing the Protection of Personal Information Bill and how it will strengthen consumer rights. Our participation line is 011-714-6918 okanye ungasifumana ku 011-714-6919. Email here to consumer@sabc.co.za or catch us on Facebook or Twitter. Ms. Steyn, let me come back to you and ask you how this act will affect consumers. How will it empower them?
Well, I mean, we all know that we receive phone calls. Sometimes it's an inconvenient time, but we receive a phone call from a company that we've never had any business with. So we don't know how they get our information and how they get our telephone numbers. And some consumers are really aggrieved by that. They don't want to be contacted by a strange company, and they wonder how did their information get there. I think we must just bear in mind that not all consumers have a problem with that. I think there are some consumers who have absolutely no problem, and they welcome this discussion, and they're quite happy to receive these cold calls. But you will have so many consumers who say, well, I don't want this. I don't want my information to be sold from one company to the next. I want to say over this. I want to protect my personal information. So with this bill, once it's in place, I mean, the consumers will have the power to do that. Nobody will just be able in future to phone them up out of the blue, because then they will be able to ask that company, where did you get my information? And they will have to give them the information. They'll have to show them what they have about the consumer, exactly what they, whether it's just an address or just a phone number or all sorts of things. At the moment, we don't have that right, and we'll get nowhere. And they will also be able to say, well, where did you get it from? Did I consent maybe, a year ago to something that I can't remember? So all of that, if you feel unhappy about this person phoning you at an inconvenient time to sell you something, you will be able to have recourse and say, what's going on here? And if you're unhappy about the answers, as Mr. Lander said, no, there's a regulator and you can go and complain.
So now you go McDonald from Western Cape. McDonald, wamkelekile nkubeni? McDonald ukhona? Okay, ingathi ke uMcDonald akekho, sawuphinda ke sizame ukubona ba singakwazi kumfumana emnxebeni. Mr. Landers, Ms. Steyn just touched on the right of consumers when you want to know the source of who gave out your information. Firstly, let me just ask the practice. What's the trend? How do people get this information? How is your personal information disseminated?
Well, from the information at our disposal, it appears that there are entities and companies and persons who make your information and mine available to others, and these people put these in a database, and the intention is that they then make their databases available to hospitals, to insurance companies, banks, etc., in effect selling your personal information for a fee. And this is how you get these strange phone calls or SMSs or emails from people that you don't know or have never met.
We do have uVathiswa yenophuma eWestern Cape. Vathiswa wamkelekile nkubeni? Vathiswa ukhona?
Ndikhona sisi.
Sawucela unicimela iTV yakho ke mama.
All right, sizayicimela ngokuthi yam. Mamela sisi man, ndinengxaki apha ne. Ndathenga umashini kwa Russell. Lo mashini ndandiwuthengela umama wam ohlala e-Eastern Cape, ndandiwuthenge ngo-2011.
Vathiswa.
Hello sis.
Vathiswa. Namhlanje asixoxi ngalomba kodwa into endizayicela kuba usifonele okanye usibhalele imbalelwano sizawukwazi ke ngokuthina ukunceda. Enkosi kakhulu ke kuVathiswa ophuma ke yena ke eWestern Cape. This is a global trend where people give out this information. It's not just a South African problem. I mean, how well has such an act worked in other countries?
Well, from the information that I know is that we've actually been lacking behind the rest of the world in the protection. So I think the European countries and other countries, they've got much stricter laws about personal information than we've had. And I mean, and that is really also, they've looked at the other countries when they did the research for the bill, and they tried to bring us up to the same standards as they have in other countries. So I think once the bill is passed, I think we will be more on par on what they have been doing for years already in the other countries.
Mr. Landers, let's look at how this will affect companies. Others have had concerns of how difficult it will be to implement. How will companies be affected, as well as what will companies no longer be able to do?
Well, quite clearly, companies will no longer be in a position to make your personal information available to any and all persons that are looking to get hold of it, so that they can put you in touch with direct marketing organizations and such like. Clearly, that will now come to an end, and companies will need to make the necessary adjustments so that they comply with the law.
We also touched on this, that companies will be affected. I'm just wondering how you will be affected as well, in terms of the personal information that you hold.
Yes, I mean, when you go and read the bill, you realize that you know, we're not just talking about the direct marketing companies. We're not just talking about the big banks. We're talking about even an office like ours, because, you know, we deal with consumer complaints. So every consumer who complains about something to us, he gives us his ID number, he gives the address, everything. And we have a system, because that's how we deal with the complaint. And then we send emails, but we keep that on a system, because, you know, in 6 months' time, if somebody wants to phone me and say, I had a complaint with your office and I want something, I must be able to find it. So at the moment, we keep all of that. And so even an organization like ours, and the reason why I mention this is that I think there are so many organizations that never thought of themselves as dealing in personal information. But they are, because they keep this information. Maybe they don't sell it. We certainly don't sell it to anybody, but we keep it. So the minute you store this information, we fall under the ambit of the Act. So there's all sorts of regulations that will apply to us. How long we can keep it, how we must protect it so that nobody else can get hold of it. So I think that it has a wider reach than people realize. I'm sure the big companies who deal with information, they know about this. They've probably been prepared.
All right.
But I think it touches a lot of other people.
All right. Isinayo umthuthuzeli yena ophuma ke Eastern Cape. Umthuthuzeli wamkelekile enkqubeni? Hello tata.
Unjani?
Ndiyaphila Nkosi.
Ndiyaphila. Yesize ndicela ukubuza into yokuba lento yokokuba uvele uzibone ufonelwa inkampani ongazange wake wathenga kwanto kuyo, seyikufonela uxele into yoba bane-special bathengisa into ethile, so bacela nawe uthathe because bakutshekile ne-credit record yakho uba uyaqualifya. Ayonto naleyo mhlawumbi engarigadwa as i-fraud, more especially into yokokuba ungazange wakwathenga kwanto kuloo nkampani leyo okanye kuloo venkile. Ndinqende ndizibiza amagama apha enantsikeni apha eTV-ni. Wesike into yoba uthi xa sewubabuza, because the very first question endiye ndibabuza yona xa bendifowunela yi-question ethi, ifowuni number yam uyithathe phi? and i-response endlana kokuyifumana kubo bavele bathi hayi siyifumene kwi-database yethu, and ndishiyeka ndi-worried ke ngoba besides i-phone number yami yeyiphi enye information abanayo ngam.
Tata Mthuthuzeli, I think ke the reason why sithetha ngalomba namhlanje ilento abazama ukuyihoya abazama ukuyiphendula kanye abantu bangakwazi ukwenza lento bayenzayo uvela ufonelwe ngabantu ongabaziyo. Enkosi kakhulu ke kuTata Mthuthuzeli. His concern is basically where people get his numbers and how they got those numbers, but it's what this act or bill is trying to address. Mr. Landers, I just want to come back on the issue of how this bill will affect companies. A report earlier had suggested that some companies are not ready for it. How do they get themselves ready?
Well, they get themselves ready by making themselves aware of the provisions of the Act and what it entails, and it'll be some time before all the provisions are actually implemented. For example, the information regulator must still be appointed, and it'll be some time before that actually takes place. And in the meantime, these companies can make themselves familiar with the provisions of the Act and start taking steps to ensure that they can ensure the integrity and confidentiality of people's personal information that they have in their possession, and make sure that the wrong people are not in a position to access that information and that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
All right, make sibambe apho ke sithi ukubuyela evenkleni. Please don't go away. Siphinde ke sinamkele babukeli usabukele inkqubo Yilungelo Lakho, it's your right. Sisho kuxa ke umthetho salindele ukutyikitywa ngumongameli. Umthetho ke lowo thembisa ukukhusela ukusetyenziswa nokusasazwa kungekho mthethweni kweenkcukacha zayo nabani na. Inombolo zethu kapha studio zithi 011-714-6918 okanye ku-011-714-6919. Ungasithumelela i-email ku-consumer@sabc.co.za okanye usifumane ke ku-Facebook Yilungelo Lakho okanye ku-Twitter @Yilungelo. Let's just get clarity on this, that if you are a client of a certain company, it does not mean that they won't have that information, that data, that personal information about you.
Correct. I mean, I think that consumers must be, fully aware that if you're a client, that company will keep your information. Yes, the Act will apply to them. They must keep it safe. They must not sell it to anybody without your specific consent. So what could happen in future is that I can just imagine that they will change their documentation and they will ask you to specifically consent. And that is what we talk about, the opt-in. They will ask every consumer, can we please use your information for marketing campaign? And if you then tick yes, they will obviously have to keep record of that, but then they can use that, and they will still be able to use some of the information for marketing purposes, for example. But that company that you're a client of, they will keep your information as well.
So basically, you have that one phone call, but if you say you want to opt out, they cannot call you again.
Well, first of all, they must ask you if they can contact you for marketing. And if you say, yes, you can contact me, you will get the phone call or the SMS. Of course, it's a different story if you didn't even say yes. And I think we must discuss that a bit later, in more detail, what's going to happen if you never even said yes.
We'll do that. So now you see Poyena from KZN. Sipho wamkelekile enkqubeni.
Unjani sisi?
Ndiyaphila tata, kunjani kuwe?
Ngiyaphila, ukhuluma noSipho Ndima eMondlo esigodini sakwaMaqanga. Mina ngike ngayithola ngikuleyo ngilenkinga leyo. Ngalethelwa ifoni la ngiqashe khona. Ngingakaze ngiyithenge ifoni, ngezwa ngabantu nje bengqongqoza bathi silethe nayo ifoni oyithengile. Ngathi mina no, angaze ngithenge ifoni bafowethu, ngicela nje beyibuyisele emuva ngoba ze baqhamuka kwenye inkampani. Ngathi nje cha, ngaze ngithenge ifoni ningixolele. Base bayajika ke ngaleyo ndlela. Ngingazi ukuthi bayithathe information yami nokuthi ngihlala kuphi. Ngavele ngathi no, angithenganga lutho mina, base bathi bayabonga bazoyibuyisela emuva.
Enkosi kakhulu Tatu Sipho. The concerns are just the same. People find themselves being called by companies or they've been approved for something. But again, this is what this bill is trying to address. Mr. Lenders, I mean, we have talked about the concerns and how the implementation will affect, or rather how this act will affect businesses. But are there benefits for South African businesses to comply?
Well, quite obviously, the benefits to South African companies is that, firstly, they will be complying with a constitutional imperative, which is the right to privacy, which thus far our South African Parliament has not seen fit to put into law. Secondly, South African companies will now be meeting minimum threshold requirements for the processing of personal information. Thresholds requirements which will be in harmony with international standards. Presently, there is a concern from overseas that they are loath to exchange information with South African companies because we don't have this law in place. And so once this law is in place and South African companies are seen to be complying, that will be a benefit to them because overseas companies will see that they can then do business with South African companies.
But let's talk penalties. If companies are not complying, what happens?
Well, the penalties are pretty stiff and they set out in the Act as much as 10 million rands and the appropriate imprisonment as well.
All right, let's look at education because it's well and good that we'll talk about this bill, but how important is it for the consumers that will also be affected by this to be educated, to understand what this law stipulates?
Well, I mean, I think once the regulator is there, they will be able to do proactive investigations, and then on the other hand, they can sit and wait for complaints. But you know, they won't receive complaints if the consumers don't know, first of all, about their office, and secondly, what they can complain about and their rights. And you know, that is where I think there's again there's a huge requirement to educate the entire South African population about this new right they have and what it entails and where they can complain if they feel something is wrong. They've got rights to ask questions. So if next time somebody phones the consumer, you know, from this company that they've never dealt with, they can ask, I want this, I want to know what you're keeping, I want to know where you got my information. And they've got the right to get the answers. So I think there's a whole lot of consumer education that needs to happen. And the consumer education will then also help that the companies comply. Because if the consumers don't know their rights, there are still going to be abuses.
Sinayo Grace yena ophume Pietermaritzburg. Grace, wamkelekile enkqubeni?
Yebo, ninjani sis?
Siyaphila mama, ngicela unicimele i-TV yakho ke.
Oh, okay.
Inkosi kakhulu.
Nginenkinga lana ngalokhuza ifoni. Angazi noma ngayisho inkampani yakhona.
Mama, khabuyeka sixelele nje ibali lakho.
Oh. Ngalokhuza ifoni yenkampani ethize. Manje le phone ngashintsha i-account. Uma ngishintsha i-account bengibanikeza i-account entsha bangayivuma le account entsha engibanikeza yona base bengicharge imali ke enkulu. Manje le mali sengiyayikhokha ke njalo nje every month.
Mama Grace, into endizayicela kwakhona kuwe kubana ubambe apha emnxebeni one of our producers ezawuthetha kunye nawe ichazela uba ungenza njani na ngoba besithetha ngawo namhlanje ayinguwo lona uchazayo kodwa ndizawucela ubambe emnxebeni ukhona umuntu ozawuthetha kunye nawo. Inkosi kakhulu ke kumama uGrace yena uphuma ke ePietermaritzburg. Mr. Landers, let's talk recourse. I find that my data is compromised. What can I do?
Well, once you discover that your data has been compromised, you would need to get in touch with the Office of the Information Regulator and make a formal complaint, which comes back to the question of education that you just referred to. as I see it, the information regulator, the credit regulator, and the Consumer Commission will have to coordinate and cooperate their activities and work together to ensure that the general public is properly educated. And in order for them to do that, I would imagine that adequate resources will have to be provided to the three bodies or authorities.
For now, let's take another ad break. Please join us after this. A very warm welcome to you again. To Mr. Landers, let's look at the importance of consumers taking the responsibility, because now they have this right. But as Rihanna had said earlier, that as much as there's a right, people will still be abused if they do not follow up on certain things. Just your thoughts on the importance and the responsibility of consumers.
Yes, quite obviously there will need to be an extensive educational process whereby the consumers in South Africa are made aware of their rights and the remedies that can be followed. And in this regard, the information regulator, the credit regulator, and the Consumer Commission play a key role, and they will have to work together, as I said, in order to achieve this particular goal. There's nothing worse than finding out that your data, your personal information has been abused, and to this end, the protection of personal information seeks to address that particular matter. And the role played by these three authorities becomes very crucial.
Ms. Steyn, just the impact of this on direct marketing.
Well, I think that's a big topic. I have heard comments that people say, well, you know, all the direct marketers, and we know that there are thousands of people working in those call centers for the direct marketers, are they all going to lose their jobs? Is this now completely prohibited? And I think the answer is very simply no, it's not. We've got a new set of rules. I mean, these rules have been written last few years already. It's not going to be implemented overnight. They've had time already to get ready, and they'll have some more time, as to say another year or more, to get ready for this. So I think direct marketing can still happen, but there'll be a new playing field. The consumers will have to specifically consent to be marketed to. And they can do that. I mean, they'll enter into a new contract, they'll get an account with a clothing store, and they'll tick, I want to receive marketing. I want to be, receiving phone calls and SMSs. They'll tick which one. So it doesn't mean that all of it is out of the question. Then, of course, I think there will still be processes in place where you can possibly contact consumers who have not specifically opted in, but you will have to, as far as I understand the bill, you will have to ask the consumer the minute you start the conversation whether they're prepared to continue with the conversation. And if they then say, yes, I'm keen to hear what you want to sell me, then you can carry on with that conversation. The consumer have opted in for this specific purpose.
We will talk about when you do not say yes, when you do not say no.
Correct.
But for now, let's take a caller. Nombulelo yena uphume Gauteng. Nombulelo wamkelekile Nkqubeni? Nombulelo khona? Nombulelo akakho. I mean, you touched on this earlier on. You don't say yes, you don't say no. What happens?
Well, I think if you've not said, you haven't got this opted out, and you also haven't entered into a new contract lately so that you could specifically say, yes, I want to receive marketing, and your name now still appears on the direct marketers list. As I say, as far as I understand it, they can contact you, but the first words must be, are you prepared to continue with this conversation? This is what I'm phoning about. And if the consumer then says, no, I don't want to hear from you ever again, and take my name off that list, then they'll have to comply with that.
Mr. Landers, interestingly, another point to highlight about this bill is that companies now will be required to advise the regulator when they contravene the provisions of the legislation. Tell us more.
Well, yes, that is a provision, and it seeks to assist the information regulator in carrying out its duties and functions together with that of the credit regulator and the Consumer Commission. And it's a very important provision in the law, and it's all geared towards assisting both the consumer and business.
Again, let's look at security, storage of this information. What does the bill say in this regard?
The bill quite clearly says that it is the responsibility of the business that has the personal information in its possession to ensure that that information is secure. It is not vulnerable to corruption. It is not vulnerable to be accessed by anybody, and that it cannot be processed except under the conditions which you and the business have agreed to.
Sina inombulelo kwakhona emnxebeni from Gauteng, nombulelo wamkelekile enkqubeni.
Yebo sesinenjani?
Yaphila Nkosi, sisi kunjani kuwe?
Sikhona. Sesilohlela abafuna ukulenza engathi bangasheshisa basincede ngalo ngoba maqala nje kusha ekseni aqalile ama companies ayafona basichithela isikhathi ngezinto esingazidingi ene abagcini lapho baenda besidonsela imali kuma account ethu ngaphandle kweagreement uthi uyabheka sodonselwe imali ngokuthi nje bakufonela ukuthi nokuthi nje ke ama details akho asebank bawathole kanjani lokho kuyamangaza sicela ukuthi nisithethe ngempela.
Enkosi kakhulu ke Mama Nombulelo, she's basically welcoming this new bill, that it will help them because everybody's frustrated on how people get their information. But I wanted to come back to something else that's interesting, that there was an argument that, or rather a notion that South Africans or the South African business environment takes a while to when there's a new law, when to implement this new law, to basically prepare themselves. And I'm not saying this is true, but it's something that's out there. But how important for managers, for companies to closely study and understand this legislation?
Well, I think it's, it is very important. It is critical. I think if we have a new regulator appointed and the office is up and running and they can do proactive investigations and you are not ready, then it is not going to help you to say, well, you know what, I don't have the money and I was still planning to do it in 6 months' time. If they do an investigation and you are not compliant with the Act, then you are liable to those fines of 10 million rand or 10 years imprisonment. And that is exactly why the law was written. So, and the plan is that everybody will have at least a year to implement. But it's not just 1 year. I mean, this bill has been around for many years. And I think companies must take advantage of the fact that they are more ready than their competitors. And you find that even with the previous legislation of the Credit Act and with the Consumer Protection Act, there were companies who said, I'm going to be ready even before implementation date. And I'm going to use that as whether it's at marketing, as a sales tool, just to boost my reputation, I'm going to be ready.
Yes.
And I think that is the attitude we would love to see. And you'll find that there are companies who will be ready. They would have done everything, ticked every box. And then you'll have these organizations who will say, well, you know what, let's hope it goes away. It's not going to go away. And we hope that the regulator then steps in and takes action.
Sinayo Sipho emnxebeni. Sipho wamkelekile enkqubeni?
Yebo.
Hello dada.
Hello.
Ndiyakuva tata, uthini kuthi namhlanje? Sipho ukhona? I think there's a problem with Sipho's line. But Mr. Lenders, just to look at the implementation of this legislation, will it be easy, and have there been concerns that you've heard of that have been raised in terms of how companies will be affected?
Yes, there have been concerns. When we held public hearings, these concerns were expressed by a range of people, ranging from the Direct Marketing Association of South Africa, the business community, and we engaged with them and impressed on them the importance of this legislation and the very fact that it's been in the making for as long as it has been. I have no doubt that when the Office of the Information Regulator is established, that office will be proactive, and so businesses that require the help of the regulator in ensuring the integrity of the personal information in their possession, that office will make itself available.
But earlier on I touched on a survey that was done to gauge what South African companies are doing to comply with this PPIB, and it found that 53% of organizations have not done what is required in order to comply. Are you getting the sense that companies are getting ready?
Well, I'm not in a position to give you a clear indication as far as that's concerned, but I would certainly like to take this opportunity to urge companies and businesses in South Africa to make themselves familiar with the provisions of the Protection of Personal Information Act, so that as the bill is implemented, legislation is not implemented in one fell swoop when the President signs it into law. It is implemented incrementally, and so as Rihanna Stein pointed out, there is still time, and I would urge them to take advantage of the time available to them.
All right, for now, let's take our final ad break. And of course, welcome to our last segment. Sisancokola ke ngomthetho ozakuthintela ukufunyanwa okanye ukusetyenziswa nokusasazwa ke ngeenkcukacha zabantu. Mr. Landers, we're nearing the end now, but I just wanted you to tell us more about the regulator and what the office will be basically tasked with and its mandate.
The Office of the Information Regulator will be tasked with issuing codes of conduct to businesses and entities that deal with one's personal information. It will be tasked with educating the public on issues relating to the protection of personal information. It will be tasked with monitoring and enforcing compliance. It will be tasked with receiving and handling of complaints, the serving and enforcement of infringement notices, and it will be tasked with obtaining warrants for search and seizure. Finally, the Office of the Information Regulator will also take over the role that is presently in the hands of the Human Rights Commission, insofar as the powers and functions relating to the promotion of access to information.
Rihanna, I wanted to come to you and ask you, we now know the task of this office. How important will it be for them to be accessible to consumers?
Well, I think it's very important. So first of all, I think consumers must know about them. They must know where to contact them, and they must know what their mandate is. I mean, not in detail, but they must know that if I've got this kind of problem, I can go to this office. And that's what we find, that even with our office, there are thousands of consumers out there with a problem, a real problem, and they don't know who to contact to help, for help. And help is available, and in this case we've got regulators. You know, there's a national credit regulator, there's a consumer commission, there are ombud schemes. I mean, this is help free of charge that they can access. They must just know about it. So I hope that, you know, but through services like yourself, civil society, the media, I think once the bill has been enacted, I think everybody must play a big role in trying to just bring this message to the consumer. And we can't sit and wait for the regulator. Yes, they will do consumer education, but I think the media is just so effective in doing this.
All right, it's now Patience from Pretoria. Patience, wamkelekile nkubeni?
Hello, njani?
Yaphila sisi kunjani?
Ngiyaphila. Ngine problem nami, I'm experiencing an ongoing fraud. ngingavuli account somewhere ngithatha cellphone, then from there last year June ngaba ne problem yama fraud. Ngine ID yami ngini, but somebody out there uyayisebenzisa kwenza ama steps amaningi for mina, and then manje bayang blacklist, so I need help. Angazi ngangisiza kanjani.
Enkosi kakhulu ke patients sizawuzama ubona bana singakwazi ukunceda njani na. Her problem is of ID theft, and I know this is one of the issues, big issues in South Africa as well. But just out of your own information, what should she do?
Okay, just very briefly, identity fraud and theft is a big problem. In our office, we see a lot of complaints about that. We can assist. So if she can phone our office, I think the number will show.
We should have the numbers, yes.
And then they can help her from there. There's also an organization, South African Fraud Prevention Services. So if she can find their number, and there they will take the details of any person who's been the subject of identity fraud, and they'll list that, and then they'll, so that they can share that and tell other companies, don't enter into an agreement with the fraudster. He's using this consumer's ID number. So yes, we can help with the blacklisting as a result of a fraudulent identity theft transaction. So she must please just phone our office.
I'm showing Ngika patients is experienced by a lot of people in South Africa. You must contact Rihanna uyachaza bana ungazama ke utsalela unxeba kwi office yakhe, and that's the Credit Ombuds office, bazawukwazi ukunceda patients, and a whole lot of South Africans, I suppose, who have found themselves in this situation. We cannot overemphasize the importance of education when it comes to people knowing their rights.
Yes, if they don't know, I mean, even, in this case, I mean, there's help available. Nobody have to endure this for longer than, after they find out. They can pick up the phone, and they are just, it's not just our office. I mean, really, we do it free of charge, but there are also other bodies, our regulators. So we really want to bring the message, and we're going to, ask your help as the media, that there is help available for consumers. Sometimes they just don't know where, but I think in most instances in areas of life, whether it's fraud, whether it's credit information, whether it's an agreement, whether it's a cell phone, there's help available.
All right, just now Elijah from Mpumalanga. Elijah, wamkelekile nkqubeni. Hello, Elijah. Elijah is not there. Mr. Landers, we're wrapping up. I mean, all the callers were raising concerns of how their information, how these companies get their information. The significance, once again, of this new act.
Well, listening to the callers, it brings to the fore the significance and importance of the Protection of Information, of Personal Information Bill. And the fact that it is long overdue. It brings to the fore the fact that the general public out there requires education about the processes, about the existence of the information regulator, the credit regulator, and the Consumer Commission, and the fact that they can access those authorities and they will receive the required help.
Rihanna, your advice to consumers?
Well, I think consumers must also take responsibility and try and find information. So if you're aggrieved by the fact that people are phoning you, you must just try and find out, is this right, isn't it right, have I got rights? And in future, that information will hopefully be available, that yes, you now have a right because there's this act and there's a regulator. So consumers must take some responsibility. They must speak up if they're unhappy. They must phone. There's civil society organizations that will help them. So I think if consumers just start speaking up, if they're unhappy, if there's something wrong, we'll eventually get it right.
Mr. Landers, one of the callers did touch on the fact that they welcome this because they're frustrated. I just wanted you to just clarify exactly when this act will take into effect.
Well, as I said earlier, the bill is with the President right now, awaiting his assent. The President has to sign the bill into law. And when that happens, I can't tell you when exactly that will happen. When that happens, as is the case with most, if not all, legislation. It is implemented incrementally, and so it'll be some time before the actual act is in a position to be fully implemented. There's still the question of the appointment of the information regulator and the setting up of that particular office. So I'm afraid there is still some time before we can do an assessment and a review of how well we are doing. And hopefully we'll be in a position to do that review and see how well we're doing.
All right. Ke mawethu ixesha ke linomona sizawukibamba apho ke namhlanje ingxoxo yethu. I'd like to thank my guests for making time to be on the show. Sibulele nani ke babukele makhaya ngokuba nathi kude ube ngoku. Please join my co-presenter Alicia Jali next Friday for another consumer topic of the week. Ukufumana impinda zenkqubo zethu ke masidibane apha ke ku SABC 1 ngemivulo kususela ke ngo 9:30 ekseni ukuya ke ku 10:30. From me, Sisanda Jonas, and the entire team, it's goodbye. Imele xesha elimnandi.
Yilungelo Lakho.